In the small college town of Moscow, Idaho, on a cold November night in 2022, 4 University of Idaho students came home after a typical Saturday. Friends, laughter, late stops that should have ended in sleep. By the next afternoon, a 911 call brought officers to 1122 King Road. What they found broke the sense of safety in a community that had gone years without violence of this scale and left 4 families searching for answers that would not come quickly. Kaylee Goncalves was 21, a senior from Rathdrum. Friends and family described her as outspoken, driven, and full of plans, the kind of person who pulled others forward with her energy. Madison Mogen, also 21 and known as Maddie, had grown up with Kaylee since middle school in the Coeur d'Alene area. They were inseparable. Shared clothes, shared trips, nearly a decade of memory. Maddie studied marketing, worked at a local Greek restaurant, and already talked about life after graduation. Xana Kernodle, 20, from Post Falls, brought a light presence into every room. A marketing major and member of Pi Beta Phi, she worked alongside Maddie and spent that weekend with her boyfriend, Ethan Chapin. Ethan, also 20, was a freshman from Mount Vernon, Washington, and one of a set of triplets. Family called him the life of any gathering, kind, loyal, quick to make people laugh. He stayed overnight at the house with Xana. The 3 women lived at 1122 King Road, a 3-story gray rental built into a hillside just off campus. 2 other roommates, Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funka, shared the 6-bedroom home. It was a classic student house, coated front door, sliding glass, string lights, and the easy flow of friends coming and going. On the evening of November 12th, the group moved through familiar paths. Around 9, Ethan and Xana were at the Sigma Chi house on campus. One of the surviving roommates later recalled seeing them there into the early morning hours. Kaylee and Maddie headed downtown. Between 10 o'clock and roughly 1:30 the next morning, security footage captured them at the Corner Club on North Main Street, moving through the usual Saturday crowd. Just before 9 that evening, Kaylee posted to Instagram. One image showed her with Maddie, Xana, Ethan, and the other roommates on the porch at King Road. The caption said she was lucky to be surrounded by these people every day. It would be her final public post. Shortly after 1:30 a.m. on November 13th, Kaylee and Maddie appeared on a live stream from the Grub Truck, a late-night vendor near the bars on Main Street. They ordered. They waited about 10 minutes. Nothing in their manner suggested fear. A private ride brought them home. Investigators later confirmed the driver dropped them at 1122 King Road around 1:56 a.m. In the same window, Ethan and Xana returned from the fraternity party, arriving near 1:45. By 2 o'clock, everyone who lived in the house was inside. The 2 surviving roommates had come home earlier, closer to 1 a.m. Doors closed, phones charged. Quiet conversations faded across 3 floors. On the 3rd floor, Kaylee and Maddie shared a bedroom. On the 2nd, Xana and Ethan were in her room. The lower level held the other 2 roommates. Outside, the November cold settled over King Road. Inside, the house grew still. Hours passed. When the surviving roommates began to stir later that morning, something felt wrong. Messages and calls went unanswered. Concern grew until friends were asked to come check on someone who appeared unresponsive. At 11:58 a.m., a 911 call was placed from a phone belonging to one of the roommates. The voice reported an unconscious person at 1122 King Road. Confusion and rising panic filled the line as more than one person spoke with the dispatcher. Officers from the Moscow Police Department arrived shortly after noon. Inside the 3-story house, they found all 4 students, Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, deceased. The scene was secured at once. A quiet student rental had become the center of a major investigation. Word moved quickly through the campus. By early afternoon, the university issued alerts, advising students to stay away from the area and shelter in place. Classes for the following day were canceled. A town of roughly 25,000, long used to a low crime rate, absorbed the news in stunned silence. Families received the calls no parent is prepared for. In Rathdrum, in Coeur d'Alene, across the Kernodle family, and for the Chapins in Washington state. Initial details were scarce. In those first hours, the only certainty was that 4 students who had been alive the night before were gone. Neighbors on King Road described a street that usually hummed with student life, now watched by police tape. Many students packed early for Thanksgiving break. Local shops shortened evening hours. The sense of safety that had defined Moscow fractured in a single afternoon. Between the last return home around 2 a.m. and the 911 call nearly 10 hours later, something catastrophic occurred inside 1122 King Road. Phones that had been active went silent. Messages asking if anyone was awake received no reply. What took place in those dark hours, and how an ordinary student house became the site of such loss, remained without clear answers on the first day of the investigation. Moscow, the University of Idaho, and 4 grieving families were left facing a silence that demanded more than it could yet give. In the hours after officers entered 1122 King Road, the house became a sealed forensic environment. Specialists from the Moscow Police Department, joined by Idaho State Police and later federal support, documented every surface, every doorway, and every object that might speak to what had happened before dawn. One of the most significant finds lay on the bed in the 3rd-floor bedroom where Madison Mogen and Kaylee Goncalves were discovered. A tan leather knife sheath, stamped with K-bar and USMC markings, rested near Mogen. On its button snap, technicians recovered a single source of male DNA that did not match any known occupant of the house. That profile was entered into the national database, known as CODIS. No hit returned. Without a match, investigators turned to other paths: investigative genealogy, vehicle records, and the growing volume of surveillance video from the surrounding streets. Autopsies conducted on November 17th by the Latah County coroner confirmed that all 4 students had suffered multiple sharp force injuries. Some showed defensive wounds. There was no indication of sexual assault. The coroner noted that the students appeared to have been in or near their beds when the attack began. While physical evidence was processed, investigators turned to cameras. Footage from homes and businesses near King Road showed a white sedan making multiple passes through the neighborhood between roughly 3:29 and 4:20 in the morning of November 13th. In some frames, the vehicle had no front license plate. It slowed near the house, then left at higher speed. Investigators later linked the path to routes between Moscow and Pullman, home to Washington State University. The car became the first public focus of the search. On November 25th, Moscow police asked neighboring agencies to watch for white Hyundai Elantras. 4 days later, a Washington State University campus officer reviewing registered vehicles found one that matched. It belonged to a 28-year-old doctoral student in criminal justice named Brian Koberger, living in an apartment complex in Pullman. At that stage, the name was one among many. Detectives continued sorting thousands of possible Elantra registrations across model years. On December 7th, they issued a public appeal for any white 2011 to 2013 Hyundai Elantra seen near the King Road house. Tips poured in. In the first 2 weeks after the discovery, the families of Kaylee, Madison, Xana, and Ethan faced a painful double reality. sudden loss, and almost no public answers. Jim Chapin, Ethan's father, spoke of the silence compounding the family's agony and urged officials to share what they could. Kaylee Goncalves, Kaylee's older sister, called for tips of any kind, even ordinary interactions, believing the most important detail might still sit with someone who did not yet know its value. Steve Goncalves voiced frustration with limited transparency and slow progress, describing confusion around the early stages of the probe. By late November, shock in Moscow had hardened into sustained unease. Students packed and left campus ahead of Thanksgiving. Local businesses shortened evening hours. Police messaging shifted too. An early suggestion that the attack appeared isolated gave way to a more cautious line that authorities could not yet guarantee the community faced no ongoing threat. Inside the investigation, detectives worked through hundreds of interviews and tips. They examined the surviving roommates' accounts, the timeline of phone activity from the 4 students, and the DoorDash order Xana had received shortly before 4 a.m. Each detail narrowed the window. The person responsible remained unidentified. The white Elantra kept surfacing in records. On December 13th, a license plate reader in Loma, Colorado, captured a vehicle consistent with Kohberger's. 2 days later, the same car was queried during a traffic stop in Indiana while traveling east. Surveillance later placed it near Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, where Kohberger's parents lived. Cell site data placed a phone associated with Kohberger near the King Road neighborhood in the early hours of November 13th, and again, briefly, the following morning. Vehicle and phone began to form one path. The decisive physical link remained the DNA on the sheath. With no direct match in criminal databases, the profile went to advanced analysis. In late December, agents in Pennsylvania recovered discarded items from outside the family home. On December 28th, the Idaho State Laboratory reported that DNA from the trash identified a male who could not be excluded as the biological father of the person whose DNA had been left on the sheath. The statistical weight of that parental match was extremely high. Combined with the vehicle history, the phone records, and the sheath at the scene, it supported an arrest warrant. An investigation that began with an open door and 4 deceased students now pointed to a specific person more than 2,000 miles away. In the early hours of December 30th, 2022, federal agents and Pennsylvania State Police executed a search warrant at the Kohberger residence in Monroe County. Brian Kohberger was taken into custody without incident. A white Hyundai Elantra was seized at the property. The arrest was announced later that day in Moscow. For the families, the news arrived after 47 days of waiting. Relief mixed with the knowledge that the legal process was only beginning. Relatives who had pressed for faster information saw the volume of tips and the multi-agency work validated, even as questions of motive and method stayed unanswered in public statements. In the days after the arrest, Moscow began to exhale. Students who had left returned for the new semester with cautious relief that the immediate danger had been addressed. The weight on the 4 families did not lift. They continued private memorials, sorted belongings returned by investigators, and prepared for the long road of court still ahead. The tan leather sheath, the circling white sedan, the DNA that linked discarded items in Pennsylvania to a button snap in a Moscow bedroom. These pieces closed the first major chapter. What remained was a full accounting of how a doctoral student from a neighboring university had come to stand at the center of one of the most closely watched cases in recent Idaho history. Even after the arrest, certain details stayed closely held. The weapon itself had not been recovered. The sequence inside the house between roughly 4 and 4:25 a.m. continued to be rebuilt from blood evidence, witness accounts, and digital records. Families received updates through liaisons. The public record remained deliberately incomplete. In the quiet weeks of early 2023, the 4 families moved between private grief and public statements that mixed gratitude for the investigators' work with a clear demand. The full truth still needed to be heard in open court. The college town that had lost 4 of its own began the slow return to ordinary life, while the trail from a leather sheath to a Pennsylvania driveway waited for the next stage of scrutiny. After the arrest in late December 2022, the case moved from the streets of Moscow into the slower machinery of the courts. Pre-trial hearings stretched across years. Discovery filled boxes. Motions were filed and argued, while the 4 families waited for a trial date that kept shifting. Brian Kohberger, the former Washington State University doctoral student, maintained a not guilty posture through much of that period. Prosecutors built on DNA from the knife sheath, vehicle movements, and phone records. Defense teams examined every piece. For the families of Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, each delay meant another season without final answers. In Moscow, 1122 King Road changed. The house that had been a lively student rental stood under long investigation seals, then under shifting ownership discussions. The neighborhood grew quieter. Students returned to campus, but November 2022 remained part of the town's shared landscape. By early 2025, trial was set for mid-August. Families prepared for testimony, photographs, and cross-examination. Some wanted the full public accounting a trial could bring. Others hoped simply for an end that would spare them further public pain. On July 2, 2025, the expected trial path ended. In an Ada County courtroom, Kohberger entered guilty pleas to 4 first-degree counts in the deaths of the 4 students and to 1 count of burglary. Under questioning from Judge Stephen Hippler, he affirmed that he was pleading guilty because he was guilty, and that he had entered the residence at 1122 King Road with the intent to commit those acts. The agreement removed the death penalty. In exchange came 4 consecutive life sentences without parole, a 10-year term on the burglary count, and a waiver of most appeal rights. Prosecutor Bill Thompson outlined the case that would have been presented, including the DNA link and the timeline of movements between Pullman and Moscow. For some family members, the plea brought a measure of finality after nearly 3 years. For others, it left a sense of incompleteness. The Goncalves family had publicly preferred a full trial that could have sought capital punishment. The Mogen family, through counsel, supported the agreement as the best available path that avoided further trauma. Sentencing was set for July 23rd. In the weeks between, the court prepared for impact statements. Surviving roommates Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funke, who had largely stayed private, prepared to speak or have their words read. The 4 families gathered statements that mixed grief, anger, and, in a few cases, deliberate forgiveness. On July 23, 2025, the courtroom in Boise filled with the people most directly altered by November 2022. Dylan Mortensen spoke in person. She described panic that still arrived without warning, and the permanent loss of the light her friends had carried into every room. She told the court that the person responsible would never take her voice or the memories she held. Bethany Funke's statement was read by a friend. She spoke of nights without sleep, of survivors' questions that returned daily, and of choosing to keep living for the 4 who no longer could. Both young women described fear that had settled into habit, checking rooms, planning exits, carrying the weight of a morning that never arrived as it should have. Family members followed. Kaylee Goncalves addressed the defendant with words of lasting damage. Kaylee Goncalves spoke with controlled intensity about the person who had taken her sister. An aunt of Xana Kernodle offered forgiveness and invited answers if they ever came. Ethan Chapin's parents and others spoke of ordinary futures erased, graduations, careers, children who would never be born. Judge Hippler imposed the agreed terms: 4 consecutive life sentences without parole, plus the additional 10 years. Financial penalties totaled more than $250,000. Kohberger declined to speak. The hearing closed without a statement of motive or further explanation from the man who had entered the pleas. In the weeks after sentencing, Moscow police and related agencies released hundreds of investigative files held during the active case. Supplements, photograph lists, and additional autopsy details entered the public record. Combined sharp force injuries across the 4 students numbered about 150. Xana Kernodle's injuries showed clear evidence of movement and struggle. Kaylee Goncalves and Madison Mogen were found together under a pink comforter, with no indication they had stood after the attack began. The weapon itself was never recovered. The tan leather K-bar sheath remained the central physical link left at the scene. Amazon purchase records, cell data, and vehicle tracking that had supported the case became part of the released material. For families who had waited years, the documents answered some questions of sequence and left others permanently open. Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funke returned to private lives. Neither has sought ongoing media attention since the sentencing hearing. Their words in court remain a rare public accounting of the night and its aftermath. 3 years on, Moscow kept the ordinary rhythms of a college town, while memorials and quiet remembrances marked each November. On or about July 27, 2026, nearly 1 year after sentencing, Kohberger filed a handwritten petition for post-conviction relief in Ada County. He sought to withdraw the July 2025 guilty pleas, asserting actual innocence, ineffective assistance of counsel, coercion, and claims that exculpatory evidence had been withheld. He stated he had been convinced to enter a false admission. Judge Stephen Hippler, the same judge who had accepted the pleas and imposed the sentences, took the matter. On or around July 30th, he granted court-appointed counsel. The Idaho State Public Defender's Office was directed to assign an attorney. Under standard procedure, the state would have a set period to respond, after which an amended petition could follow. Legal observers called the effort an uphill path. Kohberger had waived direct appeal rights in the original agreement and had affirmed under oath that the pleas were knowing and voluntary. The filing fell inside the 1-year statutory window. As of early August 2026, no ruling on the merits had been issued. The process remained active in Ada County. The Goncalves family answered with pointed criticism, stating they were not afraid of a trial and believed the evidence remained strong. Other relatives described the renewed pain of reopening what had seemed closed. The surviving roommates continued private recovery without public comment on the filing. More than 3.5 years after the night at 1122 King Road, the legal status of the case sits in a new period of uncertainty. The guilty pleas and life sentences stand, subject to the pending petition. The trail that led from a leather sheath in a Moscow bedroom to an arrest in Pennsylvania has not been undone. The weapon that caused the injuries has never been found. Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin remain defined, for those who loved them, by the lives they lived. Not only by the manner of their ending, friends still speak of laughter in shared rooms, of plans for years ahead, of ordinary college days interrupted without warning. The surviving roommates carry the private work of living. The families continue the longer work of memory, advocacy, and the protection of their children's names. Moscow has absorbed the event into its history, a reminder of how quickly safety can fracture in a place that once felt insulated from such loss. As of August 2026, the petition waits for further filings and response. Whatever the eventual ruling, the 4 young people who returned home on a cold November night will not return. Their absence is the fixed fact around which every later development turns. The record of what happened inside 1122 King Road is now both public and incomplete, held in court files, in family memory, and in the quiet spaces where those who remain still measure the distance between then and now. 16.